The weight of words. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs as I stood frozen in my daughter's doorway. God, Mom, you're so embarrassing. I told everyone at school that you're dead. The casual cruelty in 16-year-old Sarah's voice, as she spoke into her phone, unaware of my presence, would echo in my mind for months to come. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 42, I thought I understood the shape of heartbreak. I'd survived my husband's departure 3 years earlier, rebuilt our finances from nothing, and learned to navigate single motherhood while working as a night shift nurse at County General. But nothing had prepared me for the particular agony of being erased by the person I loved most in this world. I backed away from her doorway that Tuesday evening in October, my worn sneakers silent on the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself the summer after David left. The house felt different suddenly, not like the sanctuary I'd worked so hard to create, but like a museum of my own irrelevance. In the kitchen, I stood with my hands pressed against the cold granite countertop, watching the steam rise from the dinner I'd prepared between sleep and my next 12-hour shift. Chicken teriyaki, her favorite. Or what used to be her favorite, back when she still admitted to having preferences that aligned with mine. The betrayal wasn't just in the words themselves, though they cut deep enough. It was in the realization that I had become something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden away like an embarrassing family secret. When had I transformed from the mother who used to make her laugh with silly voices while reading bedtime stories into this specter she wished would disappear? I thought of the other mothers at school events, the ones with fresh manicures and SUVs that weren't held together with prayer and determination, the ones who didn't smell faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion, who didn't have to check their phones during parent-teacher conferences to make sure no one at the hospital needed them. Perhaps Sarah wasn't wrong to be embarrassed. Perhaps I had become exactly what she said I was, an inconvenience, a reminder of a life that didn't measure up to her friends' Instagram-worthy existences. The weeks that followed took on a strange, hollow quality. I found myself moving through our interactions like an actor in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Sarah would emerge from her room for meals, her phone always in hand, her responses to my questions monosyllabic. I stopped asking about her day, stopped commenting on her friends, stopped trying to bridge the growing chasm between us. What was the point? I was apparently already dead to her world. At the hospital, my colleagues noticed the change. "You're quieter than usual, Maggie," observed Dr. Rodriguez one night as we worked side by side in the ICU. I wanted to tell him that I was practicing being invisible, that I was learning to take up less space in the world, since that seemed to be what my daughter needed from me. Instead, I just smiled and made some excuse about being tired. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my nights caring for other people's loved ones, holding the hands of strangers' daughters while my own daughter counted down the days until she could escape me entirely. I poured myself into my work with an intensity that bordered on reckless, picking up extra shifts, volunteering for the most difficult cases. If I was going to be a ghost in my own home, at least I could be useful elsewhere. It was during one of these extra shifts in November that I met Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an 83-year-old woman admitted with pneumonia. Her family visited in shifts, filling her room with laughter and gentle arguments about who made the best tamales. Watching them, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. "You have children, Mija?" Mrs. Vasquez asked me one evening as I adjusted her IV. "A daughter," I replied, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "She's 16. The old woman's eyes sparkled with recognition. "Ah, the terrible age. My Maria, she was the same. Told me I was ruining her life just by breathing." She chuckled, but there was understanding in her voice. "She's a doctor now, comes to see me every Sunday, brings her own daughter, who thinks I'm the most wonderful abuela in the world." "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folding over the blanket. "Time, Mia. And truth. Eventually they see who you really are, not who they think you should be." I wanted to believe her, but as November melted into December, Sarah's coldness only intensified. She spent most of her time at friends' houses, coming home only to sleep and collect clean clothes. When she did speak to me, it was usually to ask for money or permission for some activity that would take her further away from our house, from me. The breaking point came just before Christmas break. I'd picked up a shift on Christmas Eve, partly because the hospital needed coverage, but mostly because the thought of sitting alone in our decorated living room while Sarah texted her friends upstairs felt unbearable. When I came home the next morning, exhausted and still in my scrubs, I found her in the kitchen making breakfast for herself. "Merry Christmas," I said softly, hoping for some acknowledgement of the day, of the presents I'd wrapped and placed under the tree. She looked up from her phone just long enough to register my presence, then returned to her screen. Whatever. Something inside me finally broke. Not with anger, but with a kind of grief so profound it felt like drowning. I walked to my room and closed the door, then sat on the edge of my bed and allowed myself to cry. Really cry for the first time since that October evening when I'd learned I was dead to her. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a memory. Sarah at 3 insisting I read just one more story before bed. Sarah at 8 proudly introducing me to her teacher as my mom, the nurse who saves people. Sarah at 12, still willing to hold my hand at the movies if the theater was dark enough. When had I lost her? When had love become such a burden for her to bear? That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would stop trying to be what she needed me to be and start being who I actually was. If that wasn't enough for her, at least it would be honest. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. In January, Sarah approached me with an unusual request. She needed help with a school project, a presentation on everyday heroes in the community. Her first choice, a local firefighter, had fallen through and she was desperate. "Could you maybe help me find someone at your hospital?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. "Like a doctor or something?" I looked at her carefully, noting the anxiety in her posture, the way she fidgeted with her phone. "What about me?" I asked quietly. She actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Mom, no offense, but you're just a nurse. I need someone important." The words should have hurt, but instead they crystallized something inside me. "Okay," I said simply. "I'll make some calls." But instead of calling anyone, I began to document my own work. I'd never thought of myself as particularly important. I was just someone who showed up, who did what needed to be done. But as I started keeping track of my days, I began to see my life through different eyes. There was the night I spent 4 hours with a teenage boy who'd overdosed, holding his hand and talking him through his terror while his parents drove through a snowstorm to reach him. There was the elderly man whose family lived across the country, who died peacefully because I sat with him and sang the hymns he requested in his final hours. There was the new mother, barely 18, who learned to breastfeed because I had the patience to show her over and over until she got it right. I thought about Mrs. Vasquez's words about truth and time. Perhaps it was time for Sarah to see who I really was. The night before her presentation, I sat her down at the kitchen table. "I have someone for your project," I said, sliding a folder across to her. She opened it to find photographs, testimonials from patients and their families, documentation of my certifications and continuing education credits, and a detailed account of what my work actually entailed. Her expression shifted as she read, confusion replacing her earlier dismissiveness. "This is about you," she said, looking up at me. "Yes, but," I said, "you said you needed someone important." "I am important, Sarah. Maybe not in the way you thought, but important nonetheless." She was quiet for a long time, turning the pages slowly. I watched her face change as she absorbed the contents, letters from families thanking me for caring for their loved ones, a commendation from the hospital for my work during a particularly difficult flu season, photographs of me at work that somehow made me look competent and professional rather than tired and overwhelmed. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this stuff?" she asked finally. "You never asked," I replied, keeping my voice gentle, "and I suppose I didn't think it mattered to you." Finally, I spoke. My voice was quiet but clear in the chaos. "You can try to contest the will," I said, looking directly at Margaret. "You can hire lawyers and drag this through the courts for years. You can tell the entire town that I somehow brainwashed your son into loving me. But at the end of the day, you'll have to live with the knowledge that David saw how you treated me, and this was his response." I stood to leave, gathering my purse and the copy of the will Michael had given me. "He loved you all," I continued, my hand on the conference room door. "Every family gathering we hosted, every holiday meal I cooked, every time I bit my tongue when you made me feel small. I did it because David loved you, and I loved David. But he saw it all, and he chose to honor that love in the only way he could." Margaret's face was streaked with tears now, anger and grief warring in her expression. "And Margaret," I said softly, "I was never a babysitter. I was a wife. There's a difference, even if you never chose to see it." The legal battle that followed was exactly as ugly as they had promised. For 6 months, David's family threw everything they had at contesting the will. They hired investigators to examine our marriage, looking for evidence of elder abuse or undue influence. They brought in handwriting experts to question David's signature. They even went so far as to suggest I had somehow drugged him when the will was signed. But David had been thorough. The psychological evaluation, the multiple witnesses, the video recording of him explaining his decisions in his own words, it all held up under scrutiny. More than that, the investigation revealed details about our marriage that I had never shared with anyone. Bank records showing how my teacher's salary had contributed to household expenses and family gifts. Email exchanges between David and his business partner discussing his pride in my artistic achievements. Text messages to his brother defending me after particularly harsh family gatherings. The portrait that emerged was of a man deeply in love with his wife, frustrated by his family's treatment of her, and determined to make things right in the only way he knew how. They dropped the contest on a Tuesday in March, almost exactly 1 year after David's death. Michael called to tell me it was over, that the will would be probated as written, that I was finally legally, undisputedly free to move forward with my life. I hung up the phone and walked through the house. David and I had shared really seeing it for the first time in months. Somewhere in the midst of defending my right to grieve my husband in peace, I had forgotten to actually live in the space we had created together. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where David was buried. I hadn't been there since the funeral. The legal battle had consumed so much energy that I had barely had time to process my actual grief. But now, sitting on the grass beside his headstone, I finally let myself cry for the man I had lost, not the inheritance I had gained. I kept our home, I told him. My voice small in the spring air. I kept everything you wanted me to have, but I don't know how to live in it without you. The answer, when it came, wasn't dramatic or mystical. It was simply the memory of David's voice reading me passages from travel books, the way his eyes lit up when I talked about the paintings I wanted to create, the dreams we had shared for the life we would build when we had more time. I started small. I converted David's home office into a studio, filling it with easels and canvases and the smell of oil paints. I enrolled in an Italian language class at the community college. I began work on the novel I had been talking about for years, a story about a woman who discovers her own strength after loss. The family relationships never fully healed. Margaret and I maintained a polite distance, exchanging holiday cards and brief conversations at community events. Some of David's siblings reached out eventually, offering tentative apologies and invitations to family gatherings. I accepted some and declined others, learning to navigate relationships on my own terms rather than bending myself into shapes designed to please others. Cynthia surprised me by showing up at my door one evening in late summer, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of genuine remorse. I was jealous, she said simply. When I invited her in, David and you had something real, and I was jealous of that. I'm sorry for how I acted. We didn't become close friends, but we found a way to be civil, even warm on occasion. It felt like progress. 2 years after David's death, I took my first trip to Italy. I had worried it would be too painful, traveling alone to a place we had planned to explore together. But instead, I found it liberating. I painted landscapes in Tuscany, ate gelato for breakfast in Rome, learned to ask for directions in halting Italian from strangers who became temporary friends. On my last night in Florence, I called my sister-in-law Tony's wife, Maria, who had been one of the few family members to treat me with consistent kindness over the years. I think I understand now, I told her as I watched the sunset over the Arno River. David didn't leave me everything because he felt guilty about how his family treated me. He left it to me because he knew I would use it to live the life we dreamed of together. He knew I would honor what we built. He knew you were strong enough to survive losing him, Maria said quietly. That's not something you leave to just anyone. I returned home with a suitcase full of paintings and a heart that felt lighter than it had in years. The house welcomed me back like an old friend, familiar and comfortable in a way it hadn't been since David's death. I kept teaching. The students and the art had always been a source of joy, and I wasn't ready to give that up. But I also began showing my paintings in local galleries, started a small art therapy program for grieving widows, and yes, I worked on my novel.
The book, when I finally finished it 3 years later, was the story of a woman who learns to trust her own worth after spending years seeking validation from others. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its readers, women who recognized something of themselves in the protagonist's journey from self-doubt to self-acceptance. At the book launch, held in our town's small independent bookstore, I looked out at the crowd and saw a life I had built entirely for myself. There were my students, past and present, beaming with pride. There were friends from my art classes, fellow teachers, members of the grief support group I had started facilitating. There were even a few of David's family members, Maria and her husband, one of his cousins who had always been kind. Margaret was there too, sitting in the back row, her face unreadable. After the reading, she approached me hesitantly. "I read your book," she said simply. "It made me think about things differently." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's enough. "David would be proud of you," she added, and for the first time in 5 years I saw something in her eyes that looked like respect. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. That night, I sat in my studio, surrounded by paintings and books and all the evidence of a life lived fully. I thought about the woman I had been on that terrible day in the funeral home, how small I had felt under the weight of their judgment, how I had questioned my own worth based on their narrow definitions of value. I thought about David's letter, the way he had seen me more clearly than I had seen myself, how he had used his final act to remind me of my own strength. But mostly I thought about how justice isn't always dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent, like water wearing down stone. Sometimes it's simply the act of living well, of refusing to shrink yourself to fit other people's expectations, of building a life so full and meaningful that the opinions of those who would diminish you become irrelevant. I had been called a babysitter, as if caring for others was somehow shameful work. But I had spent 5 years learning that there is profound dignity in tending to the people and dreams and possibilities that matter to you. I had learned that love, real love, sees and honors and protects what it values most. The house was quiet around me, but it wasn't the hollow silence of early grief. It was the peaceful quiet of a life settled into its own rhythm, confident in its own worth, no longer seeking permission to exist. In my desk drawer, I kept David's letter, the one that had changed everything. Sometimes I reread it, not because I needed the reminder of his love, but because I needed to remember the woman he saw in me, the woman I had learned to see in myself. She was never just a babysitter. She was never just anything.
She was exactly who she was supposed to be, and that, it turned out, was more than enough.